And it's time for Uncancelled, where the world's top commentators speak out on controversial issues without the fear of the cancel culture sweeping the rest of the media. Tonight, I'm joined by renowned American opinion writer and editor Bari Weiss. Bari became the most talked about woman in international journalism last year following her exit from the New York Times. Bari had been hired to bring in diversity of opinion at the newspaper as an op-ed editor and writer, but decided to resign due to the paper's hostility to free speech and open inquiry. In particular, she had faced criticism over the publication of Republican Senator Tom Cotton's op-ed, which argued for sending in military troops to US cities to quash unrest that had broken out in the aftermath of the death of George Floyd. Following her resignation, Bari penned a stirring open letter in which she claimed that Twitter had become the ultimate editor of the paper, and she alleged that it had become a kind of performance space where stories were chosen to satisfy a narrow left-wing audience. She wrote, "I was always taught that journalists were charged with writing the first draft of history. Now history itself is one more thing moulded to fit the needs of a predetermined narrative. My own forays into wrongthink have made me the subject of constant bullying by colleagues who disagree with my views." Bari's resignation made front-page news and featured in the Twitter feeds of Donald Trump and his son Donald Trump Jr. And it set a bomb off under an already combustible row over free speech that is currently raging through institutions across the globe. Since her resignation, Bari has launched her top-rated podcast, Honestly, and has been outspoken on the rise of the woke mob and cancel culture. In a recent piece, she warned that young American writers are staying silent for fear of being cancelled by a liberal zealous cabal. Bari joins me live now from Los Angeles. So, Bari, explain. Great to have you here, by the way. And I think what you did last year was so brave and prompted such an important conversation. But can you explain to UK viewers who aren't necessarily aware of the influence that the New York Times has in America, just what that newspaper means to America and what happened before your very eyes when you were there?
Well, if Catholics can think about the importance of the Vatican and the Pope to their religion, that is the role that the New York Times plays in liberal elite America. Historically, the New York Times, it's the precedent in the States is different than it is in Britain, right? You pick up a certain paper, you're getting a certain view. And maybe that's healthier. But the way that it's worked here, and I think this was a reflection of kind of post-war consensus politics, was that the New York Times was able to brand itself for years as the paper of record. The concept, right, was that even though we know that we're all subjective, we strive for objectivity. We strive to hold up a mirror to the country as it is, not just, the politics of a place like the Upper West Side or Berkeley, which is where a lot of New York Times readers live, but hold up the mirror to the society as it actually is. And what has happened, and there's economic and also political and ideological reasons for this, is the abandonment of that mission. An abandonment that's happened sort of slowly and then all at once. And I was really there and I had a front row seat to the collapse of the old model and the replacement of that old model, the kind of old school liberal ideal, with the new one. And in seeing that, it's really important for people to understand that it's not just a story about the New York Times. It's a story about institutional capture that's happening all over this country. It's happening in Hollywood. It's happening in our publishing houses. It's happening in our tech companies. Increasingly, it's happening in corporate America. And it's absolutely happening in our newspapers. The reasons for that, that's a much larger conversation.
It is, but it's very dangerous, is it not? Because if you look at the most important story over the past 18 months, unquestionably, the origin of coronavirus. Where did this thing come from? How did it spread across the globe? Was it animal-to-animal transmission? Was it the wet markets? Or did it escape from the Wuhan lab, either purposefully or by accident? And that journalism that should have been done by these big American institutions last year didn't happen because Trump supported this narrative, and then the social media companies that you talk about, the likes of Facebook, branded any journalist who posted about this a conspiracy theorist, exactly, as misinformation. And it's just such an example, I think, of everything that you've just spoken about.
I mean, that's the most prominent example, but there are so many other ones as well. I mean, another really powerful example is, the narrative of what happened in this country over the past summer. Were the protesters overwhelmingly peaceful, or was there also violence? You wouldn't find many stories about the sort of dark underbelly of what was happening in some American cities, places like Portland and Seattle, where there were autonomous zones basically run by, kind of misfit militias, and small businesses being harmed, people being scared, people having to pay off bribes. These are stories increasingly that you were having to rely on random users on Twitter to surface rather than the greatest newspaper in the world. The big picture is this. The old New York Times model was all the news that's fit to print. The new model is all the news that fits the narrative. And by the narrative, I mean whatever the new tenets are, and they increase every single day, of the woke orthodoxy. So any story that is perceived as not pushing that narrative, as not pushing progress, as not bending the arc of justice in the right direction, as not being on the right side of history, it's seen as something like heretical. And anyone that has the guts to pursue those stories, well, they learn to think better of it. Because if those topics themselves become third rails and become untouchable, you know what's going to happen to you when you touch them. And so the reason for, like when I said in my letter that Twitter is not on the masthead of the New York Times, but Twitter is its ultimate editor, what I meant by that is that if you're a young journalist, okay, I mean, this goes for every rank at the paper, but especially if you're a young writer and you're at the very beginning of your career, and all you want to do is rise the ranks, right? You want to work yourself up from being, whatever you guys call it there, but we call it a copy editor, to a reporter, to maybe being an editor on the masthead one day. Well, the way that you do that, you certainly don't want to cause a firestorm on the internet. You certainly don't want to be trending as a bigot or as, someone who's peddling misinformation. You don't want to put your hand directly on that third rail. And so as a result, and this is the really insidious part, there is a kind of regime of self-censorship that takes hold, because you think to yourself, and I'll speak personally as a longtime, columnist and editor, you think, do I really want to die on that hill? I see what's happened to this person and that person and the other person when they've touched those topics. Why don't I just do the thing that I know will pleasure my readers and give them the 5,000th op-ed about how Donald Trump is a moral monster? That's the easier thing to do. Now, this is coupled, Dan, and this is really important, with a major economic transformation in terms of who pays the bills at newspapers and television stations in the States. It used to be that a company like the New York Times had to worry about enraging their advertisers, right? That has completely shifted after the advent of this machine that we're talking through, the miraculous internet. Well, it wasn't that miraculous for the news industry, and that's a transformation we're only at the very beginning of, right? Who does the New York Times have to worry about enraging now? Who does it have to worry about engaging now, pleasing now, satisfying now? It's readers, it's subscribers. And 95% of New York Times subscribers identify as liberals and Democrats. So they want their hit of political heroin in the exact same way that the person who tunes into Fox News to watch Laura Ingraham and Sean Hannity every night wants that thing. So we are living in a world, I don't need to tell you this, and I think part of the impetus for GBNews is to fight this, in which my country, and I think this goes for lots of different places, is increasingly living in two epistemological realities. We are living in two bubbles that are so polarized. And if you watch MSNBC all night, you believe that, you believe in Donald Trump's P-tape and Russiagate. And if you watch Fox News every night, you believe in a whole nother set of things. This is good business for these companies, but it's extremely unhealthy for a liberal democracy where we need to at least agree on the basic facts. And if we're unable to even moot the different, let's say in the lab leak theory, the different possibilities of what it would be without being smeared as peddlers of disinformation, well, then we're in a really dangerous place.
Completely. And that is absolutely one of the points of GB News. And it's certainly one of the reasons that I came here, because we're having these huge issues of our time, the lab leak, lockdowns, do they work? And major media institutions in the UK, like the BBC, like ITV, like Sky News, not prepared to even have the debate. And all I ask that we do on this channel is have the debate, hear both points of view. But as you say, over this crisis, people have been accused of peddling misinformation simply for having a different scientific view even on the efficacy of lockdown. So I think you're completely right. But look, I do just quickly want to talk to you before I bring in our panel about your most recent column about the Hong Kong newspaper Apple Daily, because of course we talk a lot about woke culture and cancel culture at home, but some of the threats to democracy happening around the world are on a whole other scale. And of course, this is about a Hong Kong democratic newspaper losing its voice for good as a result of the Chinese Communist government. And again, Bari, the world and most of the media seems to be turning a blind eye to what's going on.
Thank you so much for letting me talk about it. I think it's the most important story that's happened over the past week. As much as I write about, the strange marriage between, let's say, corporate America and woke politics, as much as I care about cancel culture, I'm interviewing Winston Marshall from Mumford & Sons tomorrow on my podcast. I care a lot about those issues. I think that the gravest threat to human freedom in the world is the Chinese Communist Party. And the fact of the matter is that the Chinese Communist Party has basically put a bag over the head of Hong Kong's democracy and thrown it in the trunk of a car and driven off in broad daylight in full view of the world. The closure of Apple Daily, which was the most important pro-democracy, anti-communist, swashbuckling tabloid in Hong Kong, it was a thorn in the side of Beijing for 26 years. After jailing its founder, Jimmy Lai, after ransacking its offices, after raiding its offices with hundreds of police officers and arresting the top 5 executives and editors at the paper, last Thursday, a few days ago, the paper went to print for the last time. The reason I think this is so important, and it directly connects to the question of COVID, is that what happens in Beijing does not stay in Beijing. The story of Hong Kong transforming from a free society into a fear society over the past 2 years is a warning sign to all of us. And if we want evidence of what the Chinese Communist Party decides not staying there, we need look no further than the pandemic that we've all just lived through. It was China that obscured the nature of this virus. It was China that disappeared the scientists and doctors and whistleblowers. And it was China that had a huge responsibility for this Chernobyl on a global scale. Yeah. And so the reason that I think, with all of the egregious stories of the atrocities that come out of China, between the Uyghur genocide and the surveillance state, and we can go on and on and on, the reason the closure of this little newspaper should matter to every single person in the West is that it reveals to us the true nature, if we still have any doubt about the Chinese Communist Party, and it should send a clear signal to business people, to other governments, to everyone, that they have expansionist interests well beyond mainland China. And so I would love for everyone to go and read that column. It's called What Happens When a Free Society Becomes a Police State. And there's an interview with an unbelievably brave and intrepid young reporter who bears witness in the column and in the podcast to the last breaths of press freedom in Hong Kong. And I think that she articulates, and the pro-democracy movement since the Umbrella Revolution in 2014, what that entire movement has articulated, I think, to many people in the West who take our freedoms for granted, is how unbelievably precarious they are and how precious they are and how much we need to defend them.
No, you are so right. I mean, I say about the China cover-up of coronavirus, and I've been saying this for the past 15 months, it actually makes Chernobyl look like a petty crime. We need to talk about China. You're completely right. Look, I've got my panel with me, Neil Oliver in Scotland, Carol Malone and Benjamin Butterworth. Neil, do you have a question for Bari?
Oh yeah, I was just so fascinated listening to Bari there. It's it's unfamiliar, I think, to hear that topic being explained in that way by someone so well-informed, articulate and eloquent. So it was a treat just to listen, Barry. But do you think that, am I right in reading into what you're saying, that had it not been for the way in which the Chinese Communist Party has been seen to have taken control of its population, that we would not here in Europe and in Britain, our governments would not have been as emboldened as they were to erode our civil liberties and to impose lockdowns as draconian as they have been? And that, as you say, what happens on mainland China will not stay on mainland China, and that you don't want other governments with sort of proto-totalitarian ambitions to see the efficacy of what the CCP has been doing in China, because if it's seen to be effective, then they may be emboldened to adopt some of the same tactics here.
He's breaking up a little, but I got the gist of it. I appreciate. This is amazing that we're all able to talk from all these different places. Look, I think one of the warnings that we should see is that the internet and social media and surveillance and big data and Google and Facebook and Twitter, these are neutral tools. They can be used for good, like connecting me to dissidents in Hong Kong, and they can be used, as the CCP shows abundantly every single day in China, for ill and for surveilling its citizens. And I think that should be a warning to everyone in the West. One of the things, though, that I'm really fascinated by is the hypocrisy of so many companies in the West that pride themselves on watchwords like social justice and diversity and inclusion and anti-racism that go absolutely mum on the subject of China. You saw that with John Cena, the actor, who apologized in Mandarin for calling Taiwan a country. You saw that when LeBron James, who's one of the most outspoken basketball players, huge, unbelievable star, apologize after Daryl Morey, one of the GMs of an important NBA team here, stood with the people of Hong Kong. And just last week, as Apple Daily was being raided and shut down, the CEO of Nike, a company that uses forced labor of Uyghurs to manufacture its sneakers, talked about how Nike is a brand of China and for China. And I really don't think we talk about that enough. The utter moral hypocrisy of these companies that put up their pride flags for Pride Month and talk about, diversity and all of the rest, and have nothing to say about a country that is carrying out a modern day genocide. How is that not a scandal? How are the people who pride themselves on those virtues not being, pushed into a corner and be forced to answer on that question?
Benjamin?
Barry, you talked about liberal-minded people having specific expectations of what can or cannot be published. Do you think that it's just that our moral expectations and norms are changing faster than they used to? So, for example, I'm sure in America, as in Britain, 30, 40 years ago, openly homophobic, racist views might have been considered Saturday night entertainment in a way that no one would entertain now. Is it just that norms have changed? And the other question I wanted to ask you is, of course, it's not unique to liberals. You mentioned Fox News. It exists on the right. How do we get out of this rut that you refer to?
Great questions. I'll start with the first one, which is deeply personal for me. It's Pride Month. My wife is upstairs. I'm married to a woman. I benefit from the unbelievable progress that has happened on so many issues. I'm also Jewish, not least on the issue of gay rights. So I'm really sensitive to that criticism and always sort of trying to ask myself, am I just being an old fogey? Am I just perpetrating exactly the thing you referred to? Am I just not going along with the march of progress? Am I not seeing the right way? That's a question I ask myself constantly. And I think my answer is this. You're right, Benjamin, that we are living through a kind of remoralization effort. The question, though, is it just moving us faster along to a good place? Or is what this ideology trying to do to make commonsensical views verboten? I don't think that it's progress to not be able to say out loud that there are biological differences between men and women. To say nothing about people that are trans getting full rights, being called by their proper pronouns. I believe all of those things. I also believe that there are biological differences between boys and girls. That is a subject that you can get canceled for right now. Is that progress? Is it progress, and this is going on in tons of American schools, to segregate children in the name of social justice according to their race? In the San Diego school system, an hour from where I am right now, there was a session held with all of the teachers that said that white teachers are spirit murdering Black children. At another school in California, in Cupertino, third graders were asked to rank themselves according to power and privilege. Now, this is all being done in the name of social justice and progress and civil rights. But it seems to me that it's more like dragging us into the past. Any ideology that suggests that some people are, as this one does, that some people are born into inherent guilt and some people are born into inherent innocence, that we judge people by the sins of their parents rather than their deeds and their character, that we, don't give people a second chance that have made a mistake, that we, put people into kind of a Manichaean category, that they're either good or bad, victim or victimizer. I don't care what it calls itself. That is illiberal. That goes against the very spirit of the tool. It goes against it denigrates the tools that have allowed us to have this progress in the first place. Because what this ideology says is that the tools themselves, because they were created by dead white men who, yes, were moral hypocrites in all kinds of ways, who, yes, judging by the moral standards of today, were monsters in all kinds of ways, that those tools need to be thrown away, that the Enlightenment needs to be thrown away, that the Constitution needs to be thrown away, that the Bill of Rights needs to be thrown away. And I call BS on that. I think that those tools, as Martin Luther King said, are the promissory note that have allowed the expansion of human freedom in my country. And that's what I'm fighting against. I'm a lifelong liberal, getting to the Fox News question. And so no one, if you go through the list of policies, I definitely fall, I think still, although the world is changing, on the center left. But what this ideology is about is undermining liberalism. It's undermining the fundamentals that allow a conservative and a liberal to disagree in the first place. I'll answer your last question super quickly. How do we get out of it? I think we get out of it by starting new things. The reason that I self-deported from the New York Times, seems like a crazy thing to do. It's love it or hate it, it's still the most important newspaper in the world. The reason that I did that, though, is I didn't want to be part of an echo chamber. I didn't want to be part of the thing that I was so uncomfortable with, which is radicalizing people and making people hate each other more. I want to make people hate each other less. I want to make people have more empathy for one another, to be able to listen to one another. So I feel extremely optimistic. Do I feel optimistic about the old establishment institutions? No. But do I feel optimistic about podcasts and newsletters and all of the things that are coming up now in the world, the new things? I really, really do.
That is a brilliant note to end it on. Your podcast, honestly, I can't wait to hear your conversation with Winston Marshall, a man we've been speaking about on this show. And of course, GB News, one of those new entrants into the media market too, Bari Weiss.